Okay, so hi everyone, and welcome to my talk, What I Wish I Knew on My First Scrum Sprints. My name, I know that you can't read that well. On my PC it's fine, trust me. My name is Pedro Gustavo Torres. And for you to know, do you know these guys? Does anyone know who they are? Who they are? Sí.
Oliver Torres y Fernando Torres.
Perfecto. That's right. Fernando Torres y Oliver Torres. Well, we all share the same surname, okay? So I am Torres as well, but we are not from the same family, okay? So I know that Torres is quite a popular surname here. So, but no, we are not related at all. I'm an agile coach, okay? So I work in a huge group in Portugal that is called Sonai. And Sonai has a division that is a specialized retail that has some stores here in Spain as well. I'm guessing that you know at least one of them. So Vorten is quite a popular store here in Spain. We sponsored La Liga. But we also, besides having the electronics, we also have sport items with Sportzone. And we also have a couple of fashion brands with Zippy and Mo. Okay, so these are the way that Sonai is here in Spain. So besides being an agile coach, so it's something that I've been doing for about, I don't know, like 2 years now. I started doing Scrum in 2010. I'm also a Scrum trainer, okay? So I already gave more than 100 hours to 100 people, and it is something that I'm also quite passionate about, right? So I like doing the coaching part, but I also like very much the training part, okay? So being in a classroom, explain the Scrum fundamentals, and basically kind of introduce new people to this process that is Scrum. Okay, so now, social media stuff. It's rare to see me on Twitter, okay? So I only tweet stuff when I'm on these sort of events. Otherwise, I just simply forget that Twitter exists. But there you have my Twitter, and I also have a blog. So if you go to my blog, you will see that you won't understand anything at all because I write in Portuguese, okay? And why do I do that? While you guys here in Spain, you have tons and tons and tons of good content in Spanish. So if you want to learn a little bit about Scrum, about Agile, about Lean, you can actually find content in your mother language. So it's something that is quite easy. So, okay, it's easy for you to access this sort of content. In Portugal, we don't have anything at all, okay? So since we are kind of okay speaking in English, we basically just read everything in English. So we don't have almost anything in Portuguese. Or the Portuguese that we actually have is the Brazilian Portuguese. And with Brazilian Portuguese and English, I'd rather read in English, but I'll explain that later. So you have a blog, and I'm trying to create content in Portuguese. Okay, so besides that, so since 2010, I got quite excited with the certifications, although I don't advise at all having so many certifications. Okay, certifications are good, are kind of a good starting point, but again, I think that experience eats certifications for breakfast. So it's like, okay, so you're a certified Scrum Master, cool. So that means that you were 2 days on the classroom and maybe you haven't fallen asleep. Okay, so what does that mean? Nothing. But if actually you work like at least 1 year acting as a Scrum Master, that's much more valuable than actually hearing a Scrum trainer for 2 days. So yes, so through the Scrum Alliance, I'm a certified Scrum Professional, Scrum Master, Scrum Product Owner, and lately certified Scrum Developer. And I also have the Professional Scrum Master by the Scrum Org, okay? And yes, it is 3 times in a row. So it all began in Bilbao in 2013, and you guys liked me so much that I came back for Barcelona last year, and now in Madrid. So I discovered that actually attending Conferencia Hard Spain is a great way to meet Spain. So yes. And you have lovely cities, so yes, I'm loving Madrid. I also love Bilbao and Barcelona, so yeah, you have an awesome country. So, basically wrapping up all this presentation of myself, I think it's fair to say that if you want to kind of describe me in like 3 sentences, I'm Portuguese, okay, with a Spanish name, and I speak English, okay? E un poquito de español también, ¿vale? Okay, so let's start. Basically, what inspired me to make this presentation was the Scrum Guide, okay? So the Scrum Guide by itself motivated me to create this talk. Let me explain you why. So if you actually take a look to the Scrum Guide, it's a really, really easy reading book, right? It's like 16 pages, that's it. And what it talks about, it says, okay, so you have a couple of roles to have this framework working, okay? So that's something that you all guys need to start learning. Scrum is not a methodology, it is a framework, although everybody says that it's a methodology. And in the coffee break, I explain the differences. But yes, it says, okay, you have at least 3 roles, you have 2 artifacts, a couple of meetings, and you need to have some transparency, so grab yourself a definition of done and have some burn down charts. And that's it, okay? Everything else is up to you guys to know exactly what you want to do. So user stories, estimations, story points, all of that is something that is not mentioned on the Scrum Guide at all. So Scrum Guide is really, really lightweight. It's like, okay, so these are the basics, the fundamentals, and now it's up to you to survive using Scrum. And that's not that fair, right? Because Scrum is really good, but it is really hard to start your first steps on this. So the idea here is, okay, so since the Scrum Guide doesn't explain a lot of things, and I think it's kind of okay for the Scrum Guide to be vague, I kind of created like the best tips that if I would go and start using Scrum, what should I actually use in order to be a little bit more successful, so that this kind of beginning of the journey wouldn't be so painful, okay? So my first advice to you would be definitely to use user stories, okay? So user stories are completely different from use cases, okay? User stories is kind of describing any requirement being functional or not functional through the eyes of the customer, okay? So it's like, okay, I have my application, I have my website, I have my framework, my platform, something like that. How is the user going to interact with it, okay? So is the user going to have add to basket? Is he going to have a checkout? How is he's going to use the product that you are building? So a user story kind of assures that for you, because I'm always writing my requirement through the eyes, through the perspective of a customer, okay? And that's really good. So don't write user stories saying, I as a developer, I want to do this, or I as a product owner, I want to do that. No, always think in the eyes of the customer. So all your requirements, more or less, will always bring value to the customer because you're thinking of the customer when you're actually writing your requirements. So user stories are a really good starting point. What about estimations? So estimations here are kind of a little bit tricky, right? Because you can do your ideal days, so almost like the old school, saying, okay, so if I have like a perfect day, no meetings, no emails, no nothing, so I'm just sitting in front of my computer and doing my work, how long it would take me to actually implement a specific user story. And you can use days. Although, obviously, the most popular one, and definitely my favorite, are the story points. And why? Because basically story points is just kind of comparing things, right? So if this would be a 1, let's say, then a 1 liter bottle, I don't know, maybe a 5 or a 3. So you just need to compare the size of all your requirements, and maybe imagine like boxes, saying, okay, so this is the box of 1 story point, this is the box of 2 story points, and this is the box of 3 story points. And then you just grab your requirement and say, where does this kind seems to fit? And you say, okay, so all these 3 story points seem more or less like this one, so let me put it here, okay? And it's much faster and easier to estimate, right? Because you're not actually saying that something is going to take like 1 day or 2 days to be implemented. You're just saying that this thing is bigger than the other, or these 2 things are more or less the same, okay? And another thing, story points, we are actually measuring effort and not complexity, okay? It's all about the effort. At the end of the day, the effort will be more or less translated in a time period, okay? And you will understand with time that probably 1 story point will take you like half day to 1 day or 1 day and a half to implement it. So this is something that as soon as your team starts working, you will understand exactly what a story point is in kind of time interval, all right? But yeah, so it's something that is really interesting. So you can actually use your story points. And although, advice, it is quite challenging to sell this to like the C-level, okay? It's not easy to go to the president of a company and say, look, we don't use days anymore, we use story point and it is awesome. Doesn't work like that, okay? The only advantage here is, since you have a sprint, and you actually have a start and end date that everybody knows, the challenge is not how long is this going to take, it's actually, okay, so in 2 weeks, how much work can I actually put here, okay? So this is more or less how it should work. So what about size? So here in user stories, size matters, okay? But a little bit the other way around. So the smaller the better, okay? So nobody likes to work on a big user story. Big user stories are terrible, and basically because if you have like 3 user stories that are that big, and it's going to take you like 7-8 days of your sprint, imagine in a 2-week sprint, to implement, basically what you are doing is not Scrum. You're doing a mini waterfall, right? Because you're going to take the whole sprint developing, and then it's just like, okay, so 1 day to testing, enjoy. Well, this is basically a mini waterfall, right? Cascata. And yeah, so you should have small user stories. Small user stories basically help you maintain a flow, a steady flow. So as soon as you finish something, you can start testing it while you develop other things. So you achieve a parallelism between development and testing, which will make you go much faster. And also, small things, right? So small user stories are less complex, less risky. So you won't have a lot of misunderstandings because it's quite a small thing to actually to understand. So it will be much easier. So it's probably one of the best ways to manage risk inside a sprint. So have small stuff, right? Because you will see a lot of things happening inside your sprint because the user stories are small. Tasks. So tasks in Jira are called subtasks, and that's something that I hate in Jira because you have tasks and subtasks, and then we are talking about tasks in the traditional Scrum, and everybody say, but are you talking about tasks or subtasks? And it's like, but yes, so tasks in the terms of the thing that you actually drill down in the user story is something that it is commonly used, and people actually don't discuss the real value of tasks. And I'm going to tell you why, because so I already have a lot of teams on my belt that I've worked with, and I have teams that work with tasks, and it worked fine. But I also had really mature teams, experienced teams, that they didn't use tasks at all. It's like, okay, we are working on the same product for the last 2 years. We all know each other. We understand exactly all the user stories that are here in the sprint. Why do we need actually to break them down into tasks? It's kind of a waste if you actually put your lean hat and start thinking about where you should actually cut waste. Then yes, don't think that task is something that you need to do all the time and not questioning about it, because again, it can work fine for you, or it can actually means just waste. Like, okay, so why do I need to say task, back-end development, task, front-end development, task, QA? If everybody knows that, it's like, is this really meaningful or helpful? It really depends, okay? The thing is, don't think that tasks are mandatory, because they are actually not, okay? So it's something that you should actually experiment. And what about estimations? Okay, so again, you can use hours, and that's fine, and you can actually say, okay, so this is going to take, I don't know, 4 hours, 8 hours, 16 hours. It really depends. So, but again, it's a little bit hard. It's kind of an ungrateful exercise to estimate something in hours, and you don't know exactly who's going to pick up that task, so maybe tricky. I know teams that actually just put 1 hour on each task because the software demands to put some time on it, and people say, oh, yeah, sure. So all the tasks are 1 hour, and that's it. You have your burn down chart, and you'll be fine. So something that really depends. So the thing is, don't stress too much with that, okay? Another thing, by the way, at least in some softwares, you can actually put the remaining time in there, saying, okay, so on this task of 8 hours, I already consumed like 4 hours. Like, guys, just stop doing that. It doesn't bring any sort of value in that, saying, oh, I spent 2 hours on this, and oh, yeah, I spent 6 hours on that. And then probably something is going to say, I don't want more than 8 hours a day. So do your math, but you can't spend like 10 hours working on something, because otherwise somebody is going to kill me because you're doing overtime. So again, it's like sometimes if we are all doing this sort of bureaucratic work, it's like the main focus should be developing software, right? Not saying, oh yeah, I'm going to write down on my notebook that I did 2 hours on this task and 3 hours on this task. And then probably something would say, why did you spend so much time on that? And you say, oh, come on, I don't know. Or maybe you're actually going to put all your hours on Friday afternoon. So it's like, it's useless data, right? And it's misleading data. Because if some manager actually wants to look to those hours, it's not going to end up well. So if you can, don't put remaining time, okay? And what about size? So let's say you use tasks, you actually want to put hours in that. That's fine. My advice to you is a task shouldn't last more than 1 day. Okay? So if a task takes more than 1 day to complete it, there is something that you're not doing that well. Because again, it's like we are breaking down the user story, a requirement, into small tasks. So it is good for you to say, okay, so I've done this, and this took me a whole day to do, so that's fine. And it brings a lot of value to the daily stand-ups. If you have a task that is going to take like 3 or 4 days, like, so what you're doing? I'm doing this task. And yesterday, I'm always on that task. And next day, what are you doing? The same task. It's like, it's not helpful, so it doesn't bring any sort of value. It's silly. Now, talking a little bit more about sprints, okay? So another question usually is, okay, so I want to start, what should be the length of my sprint? So I'm in trouble here. So when Scrum was kind of invented, or at least being a little bit more popular, everybody talked about the 4 weeks, right? And if you actually look back in time, having a waterfall project and having sprints, so in a month, 4 weeks, I would deliver something working, it was a major breakthrough, right? So people were kind of used to wait like 3, 4, maybe 6 months to see something happening. And now it's like, okay, so I'm giving you 4 weeks. And people were like, wow, that's amazing. Nowadays, everybody's a little bit more demanding. So the 2 weeks sound like much more like the sweet spot. It's like, okay, I want to see stuff happening every 2 weeks. That's the rhythm that I want with you. I'm not saying that 2 weeks are, again, mandatory. So I worked in teams that were working like in just 1 week sprint. But maybe it's just a little bit too short. But yes, everything was happening quite fast. Like, okay, so what is our commitment for the week? Oh, we want to do this, this, and that. Okay, kind of worked. 3 weeks, a little bit dangerous, okay? Because if you are planning like the whole work of 3 weeks, it's not an easy exercise. A lot of things happen in 3 weeks. So I rather stay with the 2 weeks and actually the 3. And a little bit more at the end of the presentation, I'll explain exactly why I don't like that much the 3 weeks. Because usually you start with 2 and you end up with 3, but we'll talk about that later, okay? So my advice is usually 2 weeks is a really good starting point, and then it's really up to you to actually inspect and adapt and try to see if this length is appropriate for you or not. Okay, so when to start and when to finish a sprint. I think this probably sounds a little bit silly because everybody should say, okay, so this kind of looks easy, right? So starting on a Monday and ending on Friday. But again, I worked with teams that ended up on a Tuesday and started on a Wednesday, because then on the Thursday, they could actually do a release. So they kind of had the release really tied up with the end of the sprint because of a lot of issues, technology issues. But that was plain silly, and I'll explain you why. If you start and end up your sprint at the middle of the week, you are killing completely the sense of urgency that we have. So since we are little kids and we start to understand what a week is, when school starts, when school finishes, we are completely programmed to know that everything starts on a Monday and finishes on a Friday, okay? So on the sprint, exactly the same. So if I know that my sprint is ending on Friday, I know exactly, so the weekend is arriving, we need to actually rush things, so we need to go a little bit faster if we are slowing down. So everybody understands that the sprint finishes on Friday. If the sprint actually finishes on a Tuesday, everybody seems kind of, okay, so we are rushing to, oh, no, this ends on a Tuesday, so it's fine. So everybody's kind of relaxed. Then everybody starts the next week, it is Monday, so everybody's a little bit sleepy, everybody's running slow. And then Tuesday, it's the end of the sprint, and everybody goes, oh my God, this is the end of the sprint, I wasn't ready. So going to have tons of carryovers. So don't complicate things. Start on a Monday and on a Friday. And also, if you have more than one Scrum team, make sure that everybody starts on the same day and finishes on the same day, okay? There is some temptation to say, no, so let's have this team starting on Monday, and then the other team starts on the other Monday. In this case, the Scrum Master doesn't have so many meetings on each day. But again, if you have some common work between the two Scrum teams, it's like, okay, so this goes here. Oh, no, because these guys are on the other sprint, or they are kind of almost doing the retro or the review while this team is going to start. It's complicated. So make sure Monday to Friday, everybody starts on the same sprint. Hopefully on the same number of sprints, it will be even easier, okay? So let's say everybody is on sprint 30, something like that. Commitment. So this is something that usually people tend to forget. It's like, okay, we go to sprint planning, we look into the user stories that hopefully are all estimated, although there is always one last-minute user story that the product owner brings. And then you actually break everything down into tasks. So let's say this is kind of it takes quite a while to do all this, so it's a long meeting. And by the end of the meeting, everybody says, okay, so cool, we created all tasks, that's it. And people just forget the real goal of that meeting. The real goal of the planning is actually to get the commitment from the team saying, okay, so we are looking into these user stories, we already break everything in tasks or whatever, we are committing this. So we are saying in 2 weeks or in 3 weeks, the length of your sprint, we want to deliver this to you. It's kind of our commitment. We estimated stuff. We are saying how many user stories are going to fit in the sprint. This is our commitment. And you better not fail your commitments. Because the thing is, sometimes you're going to deliver less, or quite often you're going to deliver less. Rarely you're going to deliver more, but people will always charge you every time you fail your commitment, no matter what. So you need to make sure that people tend to be always really optimistic. So I have a team that every sprint they say, we can actually do more 20 points. Let's put more 20 points in that. What's our velocity? 80. We'll do 100. I say, look, guys, take it easy. Don't fail your commitments. Don't get too excited. Don't be too optimistic. You have the Murphy Law. Shit happens. Anything can go wrong. You always have a bug. You need to interrupt your sprint or something kind of a surprise. So let's try to slow down and make sure that we actually committing to the realistic thing and not actually to some kind of nice-to-have thing. Sprint progress. So this is one of the things I really would like to give as an advice. So if you have tasks, or in Jira subtasks, and you're actually putting hours against them, okay, so you have hours, you can't actually measure progress in hours, okay? So typically you have a really nice and sweet burn-down chart of hours that doesn't mean absolutely nothing to you. I can burn 100 hours and not have one single user story completed, or I can actually burn 20 hours and have one user story completed, okay? If you actually look to the Agile Manifesto, the real measure of progress is working software. You don't have working software because you complete a task. You have working software because you complete a user story. So your burn-down chart definitely should be about points and not about hours, okay? Because that's the real measure of progress. Okay, it's points. And that's like, okay, my software is working. I can see some progress. Not, oh, I've been working so many hours, I have progress. No, you don't. Doesn't mean anything. Could be a good sign, doesn't mean anything. So this kind of takes us to in progress versus complete, okay? So usually what I see is when we start a sprint, you have like 5 developers. So this means you will have 5 user stories in progress because everybody wants to work on his user story. And people like to see a lot of stuff in progress, like, oh yes, a lot of things is happening. We are working on a lot of stuff. But again, all we really want, okay, so if I put my product owner hat here or my stakeholder hat, what I care about is completed user stories. Having in progress, again, doesn't mean anything. So people are working on them. So what? It's not completed, right? So the thing is, everybody is eager to put something in progress. Saying, okay, right, I'm starting working on this. So I have some progress. No, you don't. In progress or to do is almost the same. I don't want to be cruel here, but again, user stories are like the light switches. They are completed or not, on and off. And basically that's it. So if your team is actually grabbing to the false sense of security, saying, oh no, we have tons of stuff in progress, you're not doing it right. Again, focus your team in completing stuff. So you have like 4 developers, you should have only 2 user stories working, okay? Make sure that you complete something as soon as possible. The other advice is, typically, it's not a golden rule, but almost never fails. In a 2-week sprint, if you don't have at least one user story completed, by the end of the first week, no, you are going to fail your commitment almost for sure. It's the best sign you can have. So leave your team alone. They are doing their work. It's fine. By the end of Friday, if you don't have at least one thing completed, you're going to have carryovers almost for sure. And basically, your team is actually not focusing on getting stuff completed. It's just kind of getting things moving, a lot of stuff in progress. And then, again, we are falling into the mini waterfall of having tons of stuff being developed to be everything tested by the end. Doesn't make sense. So yeah. And now we have these guys. What is a carryover? So carryover is basically when you're almost finishing a user story, but it's just testing. I'm really sorry. It is done? No, it's not done. So we'll bring it into the next sprint. So that's basically carryover. It's a user story that falls into the next sprint. And guess what? This is probably the worst nightmare of the team. Because everybody will stop trusting you. Everybody will be quite uncomfortable. all the roadmaps need to be revised at the end of a sprint, and people just kind of get suspicious and start losing faith on the team ability to actually to deliver things. So carryovers is something that you really should avoid. And there is also two ways of dealing with carryovers. So if you have a user story that kind of ended in the middle, in the end of the sprint, kind of in the middle of the user story, so it was in progress. So you have kind of two schools of thought. So one school of thought says, oh, you can actually try to break the user stories in two, leave some points in one sprint, and bring the other points into the other. But in this case, it's almost like you are rewarding the team, saying, okay, so having a carryover is fine. We are just giving you some points on this sprint. It's okay. In my perspective, I really like the second school of thought. It's the whole all or nothing. So if you have a carryover, the story point is like 8 points, then you have 8 points on the next sprint. You have 0 on this one. You're not breaking into 3 and 5. It doesn't make sense. It's not a fair exercise. And again, the message that you really want to send to your team is plan carefully what you're doing. Carryovers are not good. Nobody likes them. You're not being rewarded for that. Okay, so splitting a user story in two because of a carryover is almost like putting user story points on bugs. It's the exact same thing. It doesn't make sense, right? So the team makes a new development, say a new checkout, and it's like 20 points. And then you have 2 bugs on that checkout. Are you actually putting points on those bugs? Doesn't make sense, right? Those bugs shouldn't happen on the first place. And they were already rewarded on the 20 points of the checkout. If you're actually putting points on those bugs, then you're actually giving more credit to the team than they actually deserve, because they are just fixing stuff that they weren't supposed to be like that on the first place. So you shouldn't put points on bugs, okay? Okay, so what about ceremonies? So the daily Scrum or the stand-up, what do I have to say about this? The thing is, Scrum is an empiric process, okay? So it's all about inspect, adapt, and transparency. And this transparency is really, really important, because you should have your daily Scrum in front of, hopefully, your physical board if you have one. In the middle of the corridor, it's fine. So I worked in a company that, let's say at 9:30, everybody was in the middle of the corridor talking about what happened yesterday, what is going to happen today, all that stuff. So basically where we are in the sprint. And everybody did that in an open area. So let's say if I have kind of a manager that wanted to know what was happening in my sprint, well, he would just need to get near to the physical board, mouth shut, just kind of hearing, okay, cool, so I understand what's happening here. Because again, we are not hiding anything, right? But something that I already saw was people getting into a meeting room to do the daily stand-up. Because it's like, oh, no, we are doing too much noise. But it's not a party, it's a stand-up, right? So you shouldn't do that much of noise. It's just like 15 minutes. Don't hide yourself inside the meeting room. People, it's kind of, why is those guys just talking in there? Like, transparency, right? So you shouldn't hide stuff. Have a daily Scrum in an open area. It's how it should be. The review, the show and tell. So this is something also that usually people tend to skip. It's like, okay, so maybe my product is on the web, so I can actually just grab an email with a link and send it to the product owner or to someone that is going to validate my work. So I actually don't need to do a review, that's it. So I'm just sending stuff, and I'm getting feedback somehow. What I actually found out is that reviews are like probably one of maybe the second best meeting that you can have in Scrum. You should do it, again, in an open area. You should probably invite everyone that is interested in what you are building. If you have a support team, you should invite those guys, right? Because if they are supporting your product in live, in production, they need to know what is going to happen by the end of the sprint, saying, oh, so we are going to launch these functionalities. We just fixed this bug, so people will understand what is happening. Like, okay, so I know that this new feature is going to be launched, so let's be aware of this. So you should invite everyone, invite other product owners, make sure that everybody is on board with actually what you're building, so that everybody knows what's happening. Everybody's up to speed. Again, transparency, don't be shy about that. And again, if the team is doing a lousy job, they will understand it firsthand. And if they're actually doing a good job, they'll take the credit for it. People will say, awesome work, okay, so let's grab some beers. So it's something that should happen like that, okay? What about retrospectives? Another thing that if we are kind of, okay, so the sprint's not going so well, let's skip retrospective. I know that retrospectives, as a goal, it's basically saying, okay, so let's stop for 1 hour or so to think how we can actually improve. And some people say, look, we don't need a meeting for that. I'm working and I can actually think about things that we want to improve. But again, it's like you're just taking things too lightly. You should stop to think. It's like, improvement is really serious, right? Because that's why we are doing sprints. We want to grab feedback, but we want to improve as well, right? It's like the lesson learned or post-mortem on a traditional project. But in those cases, it's just like kind of looking into the past and just cry about things. While in a sprint, you actually have the opportunity to change something on the following sprint. So retrospective is something really important. And you should use post-its as well, right? Because if, let's say that we are all doing here a retrospective, everybody will start speaking, and now I want to say something and I will forget, or maybe I'm quite shy, so I won't say anything at all. So if you actually hand post-its to people and give them like 10 minutes to think about what happened on the last 2 weeks, because again, we are asking for a long period of time, right? I don't remember what I ate for lunch yesterday, so 2 weeks is something that I really need to kind of sit down, silence, kind of wrote stuff down. So write one item per post-it and just do the regular exercise, great things that didn't went up so well, just hang them on the wall, maybe just kind of match the post-its that are quite common, so you can see with the post-its what are the most serious issues. You can see if there is a lot more things on the wrong side, that the sprint was not that good. And you can make sure that everybody can actually discuss, and we can take some action points from there. Because that's the other thing that retrospective should have, action points, right? It's like, okay, we identified good things, bad things, what do we want to change? And again, if you have like 10 things to change, don't try to change the world in just one sprint. It's like, okay, let's pick 2 things that we want to change from all these 10. Grab those 2 action points and try to improve. If the other 8 will come up on the next retrospective, then you'll deal with those. If you try to actually change 10 things on a single sprint, you won't be that effective, okay? Grooming. So grooming here, or wash-up, is basically something that is not mentioned on the Scrum Guide, okay? So Scrum Guide says you need to work in sprints, but nobody tells you how these sprints start one after the other and the other and the other. So with a meeting like this, okay, so before ending the sprint, you're actually planning or at least estimating the user stories that they are going into the next sprint, okay? And this is really important because you don't want to have like kind of 3 or 4 days of kind of stop or pausing between sprints. You actually want to end on a Friday and then start on the next Monday. So you should have this meeting to make sure that you're going to have enough material to the next planning that is going to happen on a Monday. Okay? Yeah, so groomings are really, really important. And my advice to you is have the grooming on the last week of the sprint. Because if you do it too soon, the team will get to start thinking about the next sprint and lose focus on the current sprint. So leave the team alone, let's say on a 2-week sprint, and just do this on the final week. And it is actually on the final week that you will understand when you have carryovers or not. So it will be much more effective, okay? Other thing that is really important, and it's not mentioned on the Scrum Guide, prioritization. Everybody has usually more than one stakeholder, and if he's unfortunately enough, maybe has more than one product owner. So if we only have a single product backlog, what are the priorities, okay? So the product owners or the stakeholders should get together in a meeting. So it's nothing for the Scrum Master to actually be concerned about. It's just kind of putting on the meeting room, lock the guys in there and just throw away the key. And at the end of the sprint, at the end of the meeting, you should have a full priority of all user stories, no matter if they are from stakeholder A, B, or C. You should have a single product backlog with one unique priority, okay? It's not up for the Scrum Master or the team to decide that. It's like, we are here to do the work, so where should we start? So you should have this sort of meeting so that all your stakeholders are on board and they kind of get to a common sense of what the single priority should be. Okay, so other stuff that I really would like to know when I started this. Team formation. So when you're forming a team, there is basically 2 ways of doing this. Or you have teams that are horizontal teams across the layers of your architecture, or you have vertical teams, okay? So they are basically the difference is, or you have only guys that are working on the back end, so it's like the back end team, the front end team, and the HTML UI team, okay? So you only have like specialists on the team, but you have a huge problem with that. Basically, to deliver one single requirement, you need at least 3 teams, and all those three teams need to be coordinated. And maybe even worse, maybe the UI team needs to be 1 sprint ahead, and then when the HTML is all ready, then the other teams will implement the rest. So it's basically just making your life much harder. Or you can actually have vertical teams, so they are across the whole architecture. Think of a cake. How do you actually cut a slice? It's like a vertical slice, right? You don't cut a cake like this. You cut it like this with all the layers of the cake. That's how the team should be. So yes, you should have front-end developers, back-end developers, you should have QAs, you should have all of that. So it's basically a single team with more or less difficulty should be able to implement one requirement from one end to the other. Your life will be much easier. I love this question. So every time I speak about Scrum, and since people are used to kind of plan everything up front, doing an awesome analysis document with 200 pages, everybody says, okay, so should I need to estimate my product backlog with 500 user stories? Obviously not. And then people say, okay, so how far? How many user stories should be estimated? And usually as an agile coach, I say, I don't know, you tell me. And people just get frustrated because everybody likes to know exactly, like a magic number saying, 55 user stories. It doesn't work like that, right? It really depends on the context of your organization. Let's say if you work on a given project, and it's a project of 2 months, and everybody wants to know exactly when you're going to end, then maybe you actually need to have all those user stories estimated. If you're just working on a product that people know more or less where it's going to end, maybe you just need like 2 sprints ahead. I've worked in a team that actually just had 1 sprint ahead completely planned. And the rest was kind of a little bit vague because with the feedback, we would improve the user stories, okay? So you don't have a magic answer for this. That's how it is. I'm really sorry. So you just need to try, maybe fail sometimes, learn from that because you learn from failure and also from successes, improve, understand what is your sweet spot because I can assure you that it will be completely different from another company or even from another team. That's how it works. Who should estimate and how? Easy. The whole team. And you should only have one single estimation, okay? When I say the whole team, it's developers in QA, because remember, testing actually takes some time, takes effort, and estimation should be just one. I actually worked in a team that they wanted to estimate the front-end work, the back-end work, the integration work, and the QA work, okay? So they had a user story with 4 places to put 4 estimates. No, don't do like that, okay? Just making things hard. It's like, okay, how many points should this look like? Okay, 3, 5. If it takes long of QAing, you maybe actually put an 8. But that's it. You should have a single estimate for the user story. Evangelization. So usually on the books that you read, every time you want to change, it's like the really romantic version that you start on the bottom, and then everyone will follow into the top of the pyramid. And you'll be really disappointed because it doesn't work like that. Okay? I understand that it will be much more efficient to actually, okay, so let's start with the bottom, with the teams, with everyone, jump into the C-level, to the top of the pyramid, and then the middle won't offer any resistance, okay? Because the middle, the guys that are in the middle, if they see that it's happening on the bottom, and everybody up there is happy with what they are seeing, the middle management will be completely fine with you. If you actually start on the bottom, then you go into the middle management, they will start questioning a lot, saying, oh, I don't know if I can do this because of my director or the C-level or so. So if you actually jump in there first, then the middle will be really easy. So that's my advice to you. Start on the bottom, then on the top. Don't worry too much about on the middle. Transparency. It is really important, okay? You're using Scrum. You're not hiding stuff for the good and for the bad. So have a physical board, have a burn-down chart that everybody can see, have a radiator with your build pipeline. So don't hide stuff. People like to see what's happening. You don't want to do a sprint report, okay? So there's something that usually people ask you to do, saying, okay, in the middle of the sprint, send me an email with the status of all the user stories. Why people ask that? Because you don't have enough transparency. If everybody can actually see what is happening, you don't need emails. You don't need to communicate that sort of stuff. You want to know, just come down here. You can actually look for yourself. To be easier for everyone. Automation. Automate, guys. This is probably one of the best advice that I heard this year. Automate everything you can. Automate your tests. Don't have manual tests. Automate your builds. If you actually want to increase the velocity of your team, for real, it's through automation. Nowadays, you have completely free tools, open source tools that can actually automate your builds, your releases, your deployments. You can automate the tests. And this is by far the way to actually improve the speed, the velocity of your team. Because if people waste less time on the manual stuff, then you can actually have more user stories, and you will have actually a good increase of your velocity. This is the way to do it, automation. And we don't have excuses today not to have it like this. Remote team members. I know that nowadays you have tons of communication things, so you have Skype, you have Hangouts, you have tons of stuff. I'm not saying it's not going to work, but there is one thing that you really need to know. It won't be easy. Let's say that if you actually have someone that works from home and stays like 3 days at the office and 2 days at home, that can work. If it's someone that nobody sees and is only online, it's not going to work that well. Because communication, it's really tricky. People start to get a little bit uncomfortable. Then people start just to forget about the guy that is somewhere else, and it won't work that well, okay? So if you actually have kind of 50-50, sometimes in the office, sometimes at home, that is fine. Just people remote that you never see, it will be difficult for you. Limit WIP, okay? So this is something important. We've talked about that, right? Don't think or don't get too excited to have a lot of stuff in progress. Start just completing stuff, okay? So you should actually almost forbid to have like 5 user stories at the same time in progress, okay? So use a little bit of Kanban on Scrum. It won't hurt you at all. Project managers. Yes, we can have them on Scrum. People say, no, we can't have project managers, we are agile. No, you can have project managers. Let's say that you actually have something to deliver across 3 teams. Or in your Scrum department, right, or your Scrum teams, and a waterfall department, or a third party. Maybe you actually need someone to assure the delivery across the whole piece. So project managers can be useful in Scrum as well. Okay, so they are still worthy. And this is the part where I actually like. So usually people start on the 2-week sprints. And you know what? People say, 2 weeks is way too short. I have tons of carryovers. We don't have enough time for testing. So then people like to change to 3 weeks. And what they are basically doing is avoiding the problem. Okay, so it's like, the problem is not the time that you actually have to deliver something. It's like we are actually having 2 big user stories that can't be tested soon enough in the sprint. So usually what people, or actually you have a lot of regression testing, manual testing that takes like 3 days to complete. So people usually tend to increase the sprint length for the worst reason ever. We are just trying to avoid the problem, put it under the rug. Once I read on a book, and it's like the best advice ever is, if you are struggling with a 2-week sprint, start working in a 1-week sprint. Because if you actually reduce the length of the sprint, it will be so unbearable to live with those problems of taking everything so long, everything so manual, that you will fix them for good. And then you can actually go back to the 2 weeks, or maybe even 3 weeks. Don't just increase this length to avoid problems, because Scrum helps you on that. So you actually should maybe reduce them and face the problems once and for all. And now, and almost to finish, although I'm a huge fan of Henrik Nieberg, okay, so he's almost like a rock star to me. So it's Cristiano Ronaldo and Henrik Nieberg. Henrik Nieberg is like the Cristiano Ronaldo of Scrum or Agile for me. But again, don't get too excited with the Spotify model. I see companies starting Scrum and they are talking about, see this awesome model, the Spotify model is great, I want to have this. And what I usually say is, they didn't start it like that, okay? They started with the basics. They did their journey and they didn't end up on a really interesting model. But they actually took a journey to get there. And by the way, I seriously doubt that Spotify is exactly like Spotify says, but that's a different matter. But again, grabbing the Spotify model as a starting point is almost like riding a bike. I want to learn how to ride a bike. So I can actually see Tour de France or La Vuelta and say something like, okay, I want to learn to ride a bike like these professionals, so I'm going to buy a professional bike and I'm going to start pedaling. It doesn't work like that, right? You buy a small bike with the wheelies, right, the wheels on the side, so that you can actually have your balance, and you'll start learning how to ride a bike. That's how you do it. You start from the basics. Don't start with the Spotify model, start from the basics. Do your own journey. The Spotify model works for them. It doesn't mean that actually works for you. Start on the same place, the Scrum Guide, and evolve your own model. And maybe actually going to be cooler than the Spotify's one. Simply you're not going to do videos and stuff saying that you're great. But again, it will be your model, and that will be much more interesting. And then, last slide, Scrum. If you're actually starting with that, you will have tons of doubts, and you sometimes will think, maybe this is not for me. I'm just having a lot of problems since I started Scrum that I actually didn't have them in Waterfall. But guess what? Scrum, in my opinion, is basically like a magnifier, you know? The things when you're kind of just looking closely to your life cycle development, okay? Your development cycle, life cycle is like, okay, I have this problem, this problem, this problem. Scrum doesn't bring you problems, or Scrum is not the problem. Scrum actually points you where the problems are, that you actually haven't saw them before because you're working like in the waterfall, where everything almost had time to happen, and you actually then have just a huge delay, but that would be fine. Scrum doesn't bring problems to you. It basically shows your weakness. But also, Scrum is not the solution. Scrum just say, look, it seems like you have a problem here, here, and here. And then it's really up to you to apply the countermeasure to solve that problem. So don't get rid of Scrum just because Scrum is telling you where the problems are. Get rid of your problems. That's it. Thank you. Gracias. I don't know if we have time for questions. No? Maybe one, yes?
Una pregunta.
Sí.
Los puntos, la medición
Sí, de los requisitos.
No, la medición de puntos es equivalente a puntos función. Cuando se mide el tamaño de un user story,
Sí.
se mide, has dicho, en una medida.
Sí, lo que debes hacer cuando estás puntuando una historia de usuario, vas a usar los puntos y debes usar lo que usualmente se usa es la escala de Fibonacci. Haces el 1, 2, 3, 5, 8... ¿Y por qué? Porque cuando me vas a decir que una historia de usuario son 20 puntos, yo no quiero estar hablando contigo si es 20, 21 o 22. 20 puntos es algo que es muy grande. Entonces, la conversación que quiero tener contigo es cómo podemos por esto más pequeñito, en 2 o 3 historias de usuario de 8 o 5 puntos. Entonces, es así que usamos Fibonacci, la secuencia de Fibonacci, y que después toda la gente dice, bueno, esto es un 8. Y si toda la gente la concorda con el panning poker, entonces, muy bien. Si la gente dice 1, 8, ¿por qué? ¿Qué pasa? 1, porque yo creo que es muy fácil de hacer hecho, por causa de A, B, C. Entonces, que el equipo te puede decir, bueno, si es tan fácil, entonces es un punto, o entonces es muy difícil, quizás es 8 puntos, y que lo haces así.
¿Todo el equipo participa?
Todo el equipo.
¿En la estimación?
Sí, desarrolladores y testers. Porque, mira, una cosa puede ser muy fácil de desarrollar, pero muy difícil de testar, que te puede llevar mucho tiempo. Entonces, que cuando vas a testar, que te puede demorar 3 días, cuando un desarrollador solamente te necesita de un día. Entonces, que todo el trabajo que tienes que hacer desde el inicio del sprint hasta el fin, que tiene que ser estimado para que no tengas sorpresas en el final.
¿Y cómo se hace la conversión de puntos
Sí.
en horas?
No,
¿Qué tipo de...
muy fácil. Lo que tienes que hacer es, cuando vas a empezar, dices así, mira, tienes aquí un montón de requisitos. Dime cuál es el requisito más fácil que nosotros tenemos. Esto aquí. Entonces, esto es un punto. Y no lo sabes en el inicio. Dices, bueno, es el más fácil. Y ahora, esto aquí. Casi el mismo. Entonces, 1 punto también. Y esto es más difícil. Sí, es más difícil. Entonces, 3 puntos. Y vas haciendo así. Después de hacer tus sprints, vas a mirar que una historia de usuario, desde que empieza a que te termina, te demora más o menos 1 día y medio. Entonces tú consigues saber que un punto es 1 día y medio, 2 puntos son 3 días. Entonces así es que lo debes hacer. No digas a tu equipo, bueno, 1 punto es 1 día y 2 puntos son 2 días, ahora estimáis. No lo sabes, no es importante andar al inicio. Y después, cuando tu equipo comienza a empezar a trabajar, que vas a saber cuánto es más o menos 1 punto en tiempo.
Otra pregunta.
Sí.
¿El Scrum Master a veces también hace desarrollo, diseño y prueba?
Yo prefiero que no.
Que no.
Sí, es un empleo a full time. Entonces, porque piensa así, si es Scrum Master y también desarrollador, o haces una o otra cosa. Y si estás desarrollando, no estás ayudando al equipo con el Scrum. Si estás ayudando al equipo, que no estás desarrollando. Entonces, bueno, ¿qué estás haciendo? Y es más difícil de planear tu trabajo, ¿vale? Entonces, que el Scrum Master debe ser un tío que solamente está allí. Lo que puedes hacer es tener un Scrum Master para 2 o 3 equipos de Scrum. Pero solamente es Scrum Master, ¿vale? Es muy más fácil. Oh, vale. Gracias.